Hello, everyone. We are quite happy to present today our expert in the topic of practical quantum-resistant cryptography and internet communications. Let me introduce you with Dr. Douglas Stebila. He is an associate professor of cryptography in the Department of Combinatorics and Optimization at the University of Waterloo. His research focuses on improving the security of internet communication protocols and developing practical quantum-resistant cryptography. He is the leader of the Open Quantum Safe project, an open source software project for prototyping and evaluating quantum-resistant cryptography. He holds a master's degree from the University of Oxford and a PhD from the University of Waterloo. So, Douglas, the floor is yours. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks very much, Francisco. It's really nice to see you again, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you and your colleagues. So today I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing on a protocol we're calling KEMTLS. So I'm excited to share some of our newest results with you. Please, if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll try to answer them as we go along. But I'm also happy to take questions at the end as well. So I'm here at well, I guess I'm at home, but I work here in Waterloo at the University of Waterloo, which is about an hour's drive from Toronto, here in the center of the Great Lakes. And we have a lot of work going on here in cybersecurity, privacy, cryptography, and quantum computing. And we have lots of stuff going on in cryptography. I've just mentioned the work of some of my colleagues here, both in post-quantum cryptography with involvement in finalists like Kyber, Entru, and Alternates, Frodo, and Psych, as well as lots of other areas of cryptography. So hopefully we'll have a chance to host some of you here in the not too distant future. And in fact, Real World Cryptography 2024 will be hosted by us in Toronto in about 2 years' time. So hopefully you'll be able to join us there as well. Now, today I'm going to talk about KEMTLS. So this is a reimagining of the TLS 1.3 handshake with the goal of using KEMs, key encapsulation mechanisms, for implicit authentication rather than digital signatures. And the main motivation for this is that it can reduce communication sizes in the post-quantum setting, because in general, the post-quantum key encapsulation mechanisms we have result in smaller communication sizes than the corresponding signatures. And in some cases, it can also reduce computation costs. So we've been working on this for a couple of years and developing the tools around KEMTLS in that time. So today I want to talk about 4 points. I'll introduce to you the details of the KEMTLS design and its performance characteristics. I'll talk about how we can have a mode of operation that uses pre-distributed public keys for faster client authentication. And then I'll talk about our work on giving assurance about KEMTLS, both with manual proofs and more recently with the Tamarin prover. And then lastly, I'll talk about how KEM public keys would fit into the overall certificate lifecycle, because in order to successfully use this as a replacement for TLS 1.3, we need not only the handshake protocol, but also certificates and a certificate ecosystem built around these keys. So that's the plan for today. Please feel free to ask questions as you go along. So first off, introduction to KEMTLS, the design and performance. So what we're trying to accomplish here is an authenticated key exchange protocol, where two parties establish a shared secret over a public communication channel. And there's a vast literature on authenticated key exchange protocols with all kinds of variations that I've listed here and won't go into, but there's kind of one specific property that I want to focus on the difference between that's relevant to this protocol. And that's the difference between explicit authentication and implicit authentication. So in an authenticated key exchange protocol with explicit authentication, one party, Alice, receives an assurance that she really is talking to Bob, for example, because Bob has signed something that Alice sent him. Contrast this with implicit authentication, where Alice is assured that whatever secret she establishes could only be computed by Bob. But at the time she establishes the secret, she doesn't actually have an assurance that the person on the other side of the channel is Bob. So if she sends information that's encrypted with implicitly authenticated keys, it's still going to be safe. It's not going to be readable by anyone other than Bob, but she doesn't quite have the same assurance that Bob is live on the channel at the moment. So let's compare two classical ways of achieving these two designs. So for explicitly authenticated key exchange, the standard example would be a signed Diffie-Hellman protocol. So we have a Diffie-Hellman key exchange in which Alice and Bob have ephemeral single-use Diffie-Hellman key pairs, capital X and capital Y, that they exchange, and the computer shared secret G to the XY. Now, that's the key exchange part. For the explicit authentication, we've added on a signature scheme here. So Alice and Bob each have long-term signature public keys, secret key pairs, and then they sign the transcript of the communications and verify that signature before accepting. So at the time that Alice or Bob accepts the key at the bottom of this figure, they have explicitly authenticated their peer, and they have assurance that their peer really is live on the channel right now. Contrast this with implicitly authenticated key exchange. Here's an example called double Diffie-Hellman. So we still have an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key exchange going on with one-time use keys, capital X and capital Y. But for our long-term keys, we're also going to use static Diffie-Hellman. So Alice and Bob have Diffie-Hellman public key, private key pairs as their long-term keys. And at this point in time, we're assuming that they've exchanged those Diffie-Hellman long-term public keys in advance. So here in the shared secret calculation at the bottom, you can see I've got two keys, two shared secrets being input into the key derivation function. The ephemeral shared secret G to the XY, and a shared secret derived from their long-term Diffie-Hellman keys involving Alice's secret key and Bob's secret key. So this protocol is only implicitly authenticated because at the time Alice and Bob accept the shared secret, they don't have an assurance that the other party is actually live on the channel. However, it still is the case that if they use this key for encryption, only the intended peer would be able to decrypt. So that's the background of these protocol designs. So now let's kind of switch over to what we're doing in KEMTLS. So when we look at trying to use post-quantum protocols in the TLS 1.3 handshake, we could just drop in a post-quantum key encapsulation mechanism for the key exchange and a post-quantum signature scheme for the authentication. But that's not entirely satisfying because post-quantum signatures are big. Well, in general, post-quantum primitives are bigger than our existing classical primitives, but in particular, signatures are even bigger. Okay? So here's a table showing the public key and signature size for RSA and elliptic curves here at the top, and then the round 3 and finalists down here at the bottom. And you can see in all cases, the public key or signature or both for our post-quantum candidates is somewhat or much larger than our existing classical algorithms. And this would mean that the TLS handshake becomes substantially larger. If we were to use dilithium, for example, we had to transmit not only the signature from the server, but also a few certificates containing some intermediate certificate authorities, public keys, and signatures, then you can see that we're adding perhaps several thousand bytes to the handshake. And adding several thousand bytes, especially very early on in a TCP connection, can have substantial impacts on latency and may be a significant problem in some constrained environments. So our approach, or our proposal, is to use post-quantum KEMs for authentication. And I'll show you in a couple of slides why we think that could be a promising approach. But first, let me just remind you what a key encapsulation mechanism is. It's basically an abstraction of Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So there are 3 protocols, 3 algorithms in a KEM: a key generation algorithm, which generates a key pair, a public key and a secret key; an encapsulation algorithm, which takes the public key and produces a ciphertext, as well as a shared secret K; and a decapsulation algorithm, which takes the secret key and the ciphertext and recovers the shared secret K. And we can use this as a building block for a key exchange protocol in which one party prepares a public key secret key pair, sends the public key across, the other party encapsulates against that public key, sends the ciphertext, and now they can both compute the shared secret K. So now when we look at our post-quantum KEMs, we can see that their size profile somewhat follows the pattern we had for post-quantum signature schemes in that they are somewhat or a lot larger than our non-post-quantum algorithms. But if you compare across these two tables, you can see that the sizes for our post-quantum KEMs end up being a bit smaller than our post-quantum signature schemes. And there's even Psych, the isogeny-based key encapsulation mechanism, which is really quite small for post-quantum algorithms. So if we're able to use KEMs for authentication in this protocol rather than signatures, we might be able to save several thousand bytes on the wire. So that's the goal in this effort here. Now, implicitly authenticated key exchange is not at all new. There's been a long history of work, both in the theory and in practice. In fact, we could even think of the first versions of SSL and TLS up to 1.2 as using implicitly authenticated key exchange with RSA key transport. And that's what we see in the Signal and other modern Diffie-Hellman based protocols as well. But because the TLS handshake has certain constraints on the protocol flow, it takes a little bit of care to make sure that it fits properly into the TLS handshake. So I'll show you the main KEMTLS protocol design. So let me walk you through the pieces of this protocol design. Okay? So we're going to have a KEM for ephemeral key exchange. And you can see here that the client generates an ephemeral KEM key pair, sends the public key to the server, who encapsulates, sends the ciphertext back, and then they compute the same shared secret on both sides. So this is nothing new or surprising. Now, the difference comes in the server-to-client authentication. So here, the server has a long-term KEM public key secret key pair here at the top, and they've gotten a certificate for that KEM public key. Now, I should say and be clear that there is still a signature by the certificate authority in the certificate. So we don't have a way around using signatures to authenticate public keys within a certificate. But the public key of the server itself, in this case, is a KEM public key, not a signature public key. And then the client, now having received the server's KEM public key, can encapsulate against it, send a ciphertext back across, and the server decapsulates. And finally, we combine the shared secrets, the shared secret SSE from the ephemeral KEM and the shared secret SSS that's based on the server's long-term KEM public key. We combine those two shared secrets in our key schedule when we derive all of the rest of our application keys for the TLS protocol. So that's the main design of the KEMTLS handshake. If there are any questions right now, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll start talking about some of the choices we have to make in terms of instantiating the protocol. Okay, so we have a few different choices now to make in terms of the algorithms here. In fact, we have at least 4 algorithm choices in the handshake. We have the choice of the KEMs for ephemeral key exchange and authenticated key exchange, as well as a signature scheme for the intermediate certificate authorities that you might have along the chain and the root certificate authorities. And for each of these different choices, for each of these choices, we could actually use different algorithms because there might be some interesting trade-offs present in the algorithms available for us. Overall, what we want for our KEMs is the security property of indistinguishability under chosen ciphertext attacks. Although for the ephemeral key exchange, we can weaken that a little bit to one-time CCA security. And for the KEMs, we do want a small public key and a small ciphertext. And for the signature scheme, we also do want a small public key and a small signature for the signatures when used by the intermediate CA. But for the root certificate authority, we might be able to trade things off because the root certificate authority's public key is never going to be transmitted. It has to be built into the browser from the beginning. So we have the option there for perhaps using a small signature, but a larger public key. So to evaluate whether we can save space, we're going to look at 4 scenarios. A scenario that aims to minimize size, pick whatever algorithms we can pick to minimize size when intermediate certificates are transmitted or when they're cached. And then also what would happen if we fixed our goals on a particular family of assumptions, the ntrue family using, say, ntrue and Falcon, or the module learning with errors family using Kyber and dilithium. Okay. So here's a graph that shows the trade-off between communication size and performance time until the connection is established. So I'll walk you through this graph. On the x-axis, we have the size of the public key cryptography objects transmitted in the handshake in kilobytes. And on the y-axis, we have the time until the client receives its first byte of application data in milliseconds. And we're going to need at least 3 round trips. And I'm doing this on a link that has, I think, 31 milliseconds of latency. So we have at least 93 milliseconds before we can start receiving data. But then we can look at the differences after that. And I'm going to show you the difference between 2 scenarios. The blue squares represent the scenario where we just do signed Diffie-Hellman type TLS, but with a post-quantum signature and a post-quantum KEM. And the red dots indicate what happens if we switch to KEMTLS. So for example, let's look at the Kyber dilithium scenario here on the right-hand side, where we're using a module learning with errors assumption. The blue square represents using Kyber for ephemeral key exchange, and then dilithium for all of the signatures, including the server signature, the intermediate certificate authority signature, and the root certificate authority signature. You can see that takes around 11 kilobytes of communication size. But if we switch to KEMTLS, if we switch to doing authentication via Kyber rather than dilithium, we can remove about 2 kilobytes from the communication and come down to 9 kilobytes of communication. So we've saved a significant fraction of the communication size. When we look at the ntrue assumption family between ntrue for key exchange and Falcon for signatures, we don't see as big an impact in KEMTLS, at least in communication sizes, because Falcon is already pretty small, not nearly as small as ntrue. If we try to absolutely minimize communication size, you can see that KEMTLS with psych for server and ephemeral key exchange and a couple of post-quantum algorithms for signatures, XMSS and Rainbow for signatures, can get communication sizes about 2 kilobytes, which is getting us pretty close to our classical non-post-quantum signed elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange down here at the left. So we can see a significant size savings in some settings with KEMTLS. So just to kind of summarize some of the benefits that we see in this, as I said, with a size optimized KEMTLS, we can really improve communication size, going to as small as half the size of an optimized signed KEMTLS. Although the graph didn't show too much speed savings in the overall connection establishment, we can substantially save CPU cycles on the server using KEMTLS. For example, in the ntrue scenario, ntrue key exchange is much, much faster than Falcon signing. So KEMTLS has a lighter load on the server's CPU. We can also do this without any extra round trips in the server authenticated mode. And we can also have a smaller trusted code base because we don't have to have any signature generation on the client or server. Now, I've shown you the mode of KEMTLS here, which has server-only authentication. We also have a variant that has client authentication so that we can do mutual authentication, where the client has a long-term KEM public key. And we can make this work as we would like. There's a problem here, though, that this does add an extra round trip to the handshake. The client can't encapsulate against, the server can't encapsulate against the client's public key until it receives it. and that ends up adding an extra round trip. So that's a little bit suboptimal. So that's what we tried to establish in a next piece of work. But if there are any questions so far on the design or the main performance characteristics, I'm certainly happy to answer any of those now. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about this optimization here in the client authentication setting. So as I said, if we're doing mutual authentication, we unfortunately do have an extra round trip while we wait for one of the keys to get in place so that they can encapsulate against it. And so we wanted to avoid adding an extra round trip, and we realized that it's possible to do so if we have pre-distributed public keys that'll allow for faster client authentication. And so the motivation here is that if server public keys are pre-distributed, we can do something better. Well, why should we imagine server public keys to be distributed? Well, in fact, there are lots of scenarios where this might be the case. The keys could already be cached in the browser or pinned or embedded in a mobile app or an Internet of Things device. And in fact, there's an RFC that specifies exactly how to do this in TLS 1.3, either because they've embedded in this way or because they've been distributed in some other out-of-band mechanism. I should emphasize that pre-distributed public keys is a different trust model than pre-shared symmetric keys. So you're probably aware that TLS and other protocols often have a pre-shared symmetric key mode. And that's a different type of credential, a pre-shared symmetric key rather than a pre-distributed public key. And arguably, pre-shared symmetric keys are a harder key management problem because we do need to establish a shared symmetric key between two specific parties in a confidential way. But with pre-distributed public keys, we can post these public keys anywhere we want, and we just have to get them, in some mechanism out of band, but without any confidentiality requirements on that distribution. So with the possibility of pre-distributed server public keys, we can provide an alternative KEMTLS protocol flow, where if the server certificates are known in advance, then the client can already start encapsulating earlier to the server and send its certificate earlier to the server. And this allows us to get a protocol with implicit client authentication in basically the same shape with the same number of flows as TLS 1.3. So I don't think I'll go into the details of that protocol design. I've posted my slides on my website, and so there's some figures with the protocol design here. But I don't think I'll go into the details of that here. In terms of the benefits from this, well, it does save bandwidth because we have pre-distributed public keys, but that should be expected. One thing that's interesting is that it makes some post-quantum algorithms viable. So there are some post-quantum KEMs that have large public keys and small ciphertexts. Classic McLeese is an example of this. A McLeese public key is really large, but the ciphertext is quite small as 32 bytes if memory serves. And if we have pre-distributed server public keys, then in fact, it does make this algorithm viable, as long as we have the bandwidth to pre-distribute those keys in a suitable way. And of course, it solves the main goal that we had, which is client authentication without an extra round trip. All right, so there's a question that's just come in on the chat from Ricardo. The question is how to integrate post-quantum algorithms into certificate chains, considering KEMs, for both server and client authentication for TLS certificates. So that's a great question, and that's actually part 4 of the talk. So I'll be coming to that in about 10 minutes. So let's hold that question to then. But it's a really important question because we don't have experience using KEM public keys in the web PKI in certificate chains and X.509 PKIs. So I'll talk about some of the difficulties in that in a few minutes. Okay. So just to summarize kind of where we're at, we've seen, in fact, 4 variants of KEMTLS. We have the original protocol with server-only authentication or mutual authentication. But then we saw that mutual authentication does add an extra round trip. So we had a pre-distributed keys version, both in server-only and mutual authentication mode, that can save bandwidth and save a round trip in the mutual authentication mode. So those are the 4 KEMTLS protocols that we have available to us. So now let's talk about the security of these protocols. And I'll talk about our work on proving KEMTLS, both manually in pen and paper proofs and with formal verification using the Tamarin prover. Okay. So first off, what are the security properties that we would want to have for KEMTLS? At a very high level, we certainly want that the session keys are secure, meaning that the session keys are indistinguishable from randomly generated keys. And in fact, most of those session keys should have forward secrecy, meaning that if we reveal one of the party's long-term keys after the session has been established, those keys, the session keys, should still remain secret. We'd like some authentication properties, and we can have both implicit and explicit authentication. Possibly we'd also like a deniability property. So in some key exchange protocols, it's possible for a party to participate in a connection without providing transferable evidence that they were involved in the conversation. That's a property called deniability. Signed Diffie-Hellman protocols like the normal TLS 1.3 don't have that, but implicitly authenticated protocols like the signal handshake do have a certain type of deniability property. So we'd like to see if KEMTLS has this property as well. So those are the main security properties that we'd like to have for our protocol. Now, in terms of modeling this, we're going to use a modeling approach called multi-stage authenticated key exchange. So this is ultimately derived from the Bollare-Rogoway authenticated key exchange model from way back in 1993, but then evolved in 2014 to something called the multi-stage authenticated key exchange model, which we used to prove the security of TLS 1.3. Basically, the multi-stage part of this terminology is to handle the idea that this is a key exchange protocol that actually establishes many session keys during the handshake. So in KEMTLS, there are actually 6 session keys established during the protocol. There's 2 that are called handshake traffic secrets, which are used to encrypt the rest of the handshake. And there's application handshake traffic secrets, and even application traffic secrets that are used to encrypt the application data. Each of these keys is used to encrypt different parts of the communication, either the handshake or the application data. And because of when they're established, each of them may have slightly different security properties. They could have one type of forward secrecy versus another. They could be implicitly authenticated or explicitly authenticated, and so on. So we'll try to capture the different subtleties within these keys at different times through the protocol. So for example, in authentication, we can have implicit authentication, which I've talked about before. And indeed, by the time we establish our final keys, we have that the client's first application flow can't be read by anyone other than the intended server. So that's implicitly authenticated. But TLS 1.3 and KEMTLS does have key confirmation messages using a message authentication code. And so we actually can upgrade our security properties to explicit authentication once we've received the key confirmation messages. Okay, so there's a question in the chat from Mike Scott asking about pre-distributed public keys. So if we had pre-distributed public keys, security would be very easy. Isn't this a big ask? And without them, isn't the extra flow a performance killer? Yeah, so that's a good question, Mike. So I would say that if we do have pre-distributed public keys, security is somewhat easier, but still not entirely simple because we still do want forward secrecy. So we need to have at least some key exchange for that. So we need to do at least something non-trivial. As for whether the extra flow is a performance killer, I think it really depends. We don't actually see very many cases, of all the TLS connections that are established in the world, the vast majority of them are not client authenticated. And so we don't see we don't have this extra flow needed if we're not doing client authentication. So we don't have any impact there. And as for scenarios where we do have client authentication within TLS, so using a client certificate in TLS, there are often specialized scenarios where it might be possible to in fact imagine at least that the server's public key is pre-distributed. And as we start to see more adoption of sophisticated DNS protocols where you might distribute your TLS public key as part of a DNS response, there are chances to avoid this extra flow. So it may be possible. And perhaps this extra flow is even still worthwhile if you can save bandwidth. It really depends on the application scenario. So I'm not saying that it is always a better solution, but there are cases where it might be, at least when we're doing client authentication. Okay, but I'm happy to talk about that more in the questions afterwards as well. Okay, a few other subtleties in security properties. Forward secrecy. So this is a long-known property that compromise of a party's long-term key should not allow decryption of past sessions. But there are actually a few subtle variations in the definition of forward secrecy. And in our security model, we capture 3 different levels of forward secrecy, 2 variants of weak forward secrecy and a full forward secrecy version. And we're actually able to distinguish which session keys in our multi-stage key exchange protocol have which levels of forward secrecy. And finally, there's the deniability aspect. So as I said, KEMTLS doesn't use signatures for authentication. And so this actually ends up yielding a property called offline deniability, where the parties don't create evidence that can be transferred to a judge, that the judge can use to rule that one particular party really was involved in the key exchange. So even if, for example, so if Alice and Bob establish a session and Bob later transfers to the judge the entire transcript of the communication, as well as all of Bob's secrets, it's still not possible for the judge to be convinced that Alice was involved in the communication. Everything that the transcript and everything that Bob transfers to the judge could in fact have been created by Bob rather than Alice. So the judge can't, in theory, convict Alice as being involved. There's a stronger form of deniability called online deniability, where the judge might collude with one of the parties and not follow the protocol, which we don't have and is quite tricky to achieve. But we do at least achieve this offline deniability property. And you see this as well in some instant messaging protocols like the Signal handshake. So these are the security properties that we'd like to achieve for Tamarin, sorry, for KEMTLS. So in our original papers, we had some pen and paper proofs where we proved session key security and authentication in the multi-stage key exchange model. But in some more recent works, we've been using Tamarin prover, which is a symbolic model checker, to check some of these properties. Using 2 different Tamarin models, actually, an adaptation of a TLS 1.3 Tamarin model from a few years ago that was developed by Kramers et al. During the TLS 1.3 standardization process. And then a completely new Tamarin model that is a very close analog of our multi-stage key exchange model. Okay, but first, let me just summarize the results from the pen and paper proofs. So I mentioned that we proved session key indistinguishability. So this is for all 6 stage keys. And we're able to precisely characterize which of the 3 levels of forward secrecy is available at each stage. In the face of an adversary who's a standard network adversary and who's able to corrupt long-term keys and session keys of unrelated sessions. We're also able to show authentication, both implicit and explicit authentication, and precisely characterizing what level of authentication is achieved at different stages. And we also model a property about replayability with some of the pre-distributed keys. And the proofs here are in a standard model with some fairly straightforward assumptions on the building blocks, which I've shown here. The only perhaps subtleties here are that for the ephemeral KEM, we can actually get by with slightly weaker form of chosen ciphertext attack, where it only has to allow one decapsulation query. And that actually can allow for a simpler KEM construction than the full Fujisaki-Okamoto transform. But I won't have a chance to say much about that. And we also require that the key derivation function be a dual pseudorandom function in both of its arguments, which has some subtleties as well. So we've done these pen and paper proofs, but there are, of course, some limitations of pen and paper proofs. They are time consuming to read and to write and to read, and might contain mistakes. So in our papers, we have some fully written out proofs for a couple of the properties in a couple of the variants, but those, of course, are only as reliable as we, the authors, were, and our reviewers and the readers. And we have proof sketches and some hand-waving arguments for some of the other properties. I'll pause here because I see Francisco's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Francisco. Oh, I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to know why it's so tricky to have this dual forward secrecy that you mentioned.
Sorry, why is it so tricky to have
the perfect forward secrecy for the two sides?
So why is it hard to achieve this full level of forward secrecy? So I mean, in a server-only authenticated version, well, we have to. I guess we have to wait until we've So full forward secrecy demands that we're secure either if the adversary was passive or the adversary didn't corrupt the long-term key of the peer before acceptance. So we have to kind of make sure that we've done some explicit authentication before we can have this forward secrecy, this full forward secrecy. So we only achieve it quite late in the handshake. That's kind of the crux of the matter there.
Thank you.
Okay, so so we have these pen and paper proofs, but as I said, they're only as reliable as the authors and the readers are, and in some cases we've been less detailed and have some lighter arguments for the less central properties that we're trying to prove, and even then, this is still many pages of analysis. So we wanted to have higher assurance, and so we looked at using Tamarin Prover for some formal verification. So in case you're not too familiar with it, Tamarin is a model checker that can assess security properties in the symbolic model. So you specify your protocol and adversary as a set of state machine transitions, and then you can specify a security property as a predicate over the actions recorded during state machine transitions. And then Tamarin will explore the state space to either find an execution trace that violates the property, or verify that none exists, ideally, or perhaps it will fail to terminate because it's gotten, it has an infinite space that it needs to explore. Tamarin's been successfully used for many years now on a variety of academic and real-world cryptographic protocols. And it's been especially effective on key exchange protocols. And there is a very prominent use of it in analyzing the TLS 1.3 drafts. But it is a fairly intensive effort to use Tamarin. The TLS 1.3 analysis was many months of person effort and required a lot of manual encoding of lemmas to help Tamarin prove its results. And in the end required a week of computation time on a quite beefy server using more than 100 gigabytes of RAM. So it's a non-trivial effort to do so, but we thought it was worthwhile to do so for KEMTLS to improve confidence in the protocol. So we actually did it twice because that seemed like more fun. So in the first approach, we adopted this model of TLS 1.3 from the previous slide to the KEMTLS scenario. And this is a very high resolution model in terms of the protocol specification. So it's designed to capture the TLS message format. It has like an encoding of the TLS message format in Tamarin's model. It's very detailed in terms of the protocol design. It, for example, breaks the key derivation function into HMAC, and it breaks HMAC down into hash function calls. So it's quite detailed there. But it also has lower resolution security properties. So it doesn't have all the subtleties of forward secrecy that I mentioned for all the different stages of the handshake, and required a fair bit of manual effort to get the proofs running automatically. We also did a second model of KEMTLS in Tamarin, which kind of directly translate the pen and paper security definitions into Tamarin. Now, this comes at the cost of having a lower resolution protocol specification. So we're not explicitly using every field in the TLS message format. We're kind of representing what would be called, say, the cryptographic core of KEMTLS, as a cryptographer might write it down in a paper, not as a standards person might write it down in a standard. But on the flip side, we're able to model security properties with higher resolution. So more detail in the forward secrecy properties, more detail in the adversary model with different powers for the adversary to reveal intermediate keys. And it turns out this one actually proves much simpler in Tamarin with less effort to specify and have it automatically prove. So we just kind of see this trade-off between a higher resolution protocol specification and higher resolution security properties. And I've got a chart here showing the comparison between the different subtleties in the two models, but maybe I won't say much more about that, except to highlight that, among other things, in this second approach, we're able to do extra security properties like deniability that we weren't able to do in the first approach. Okay. So this was a really interesting exercise. For me personally, this was the first time that I'd actually tried to prove something with Tamarin. So it was a great learning experience and not as painful as I would have imagined. So I would encourage you to try a tool like this. Tamarin has actually gotten much easier to use and more powerful over the past few years. So in terms of lessons learned, well, it certainly gave us higher assurance in our protocol design. And one of the nice things about the formal models is that we're actually able to capture the potential of interactions between all four protocol variants. So the models, the Tamarin models, run all four variants, server only, mutual authenticated, and with pre-distributed keys, all in the same execution environment. And so we can check for the possibility that there's some unintended failure mode when they're running interactively together. And as I mentioned, this work does kind of exhibit the difficulty in trading off, the difficulty trade-off in formal verification, whether you want to go for highly granular protocols or highly granular security properties. It's really hard to do both at the same time. And the formal verification work also identified some bugs in previous work. So when we adapted the first model, the previous TLS 1.3 model, we actually found some bugs in the TLS 1.3 model by adapting it to KEMTLS. And in the second approach, we identified some minor bugs in security properties that were stated in the pen and paper proofs. Nothing really major, but a couple of stages said that they were weak forward secrecy level 2, when in fact they were weak forward secrecy level 1. So those kind of subtleties, when there's dozens and dozens of them, can be hard to do perfectly in a pen and paper proof. But fortunately, Tamarin identified those inconsistencies for us. So at the end of this formal verification, I guess we have a bit more confidence in our protocol. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and I know I'm near the end, so I'm going to have to go through this a little bit quickly, is certificates. So we wanted to make sure that not only could this work on paper, but it would work in situ, and that would mean having certificates with KEM public keys in them. Now these certificates, of course, as I said, will have signatures from a certificate authority, but the server's certificate itself will contain a server KEM public key signed by a certificate authority signature scheme. So we still have some signatures along the way, but the end entity certificate is a KEM public key. Okay. So if we think about the certificate lifecycle, first we have a requester who generates a key and then requests a certificate from a certificate authority. The certificate authority will verify the certificate request and the requester's identity, and if all those pass, they'll issue a certificate, which the requester will then use. And then eventually, perhaps later in the life cycle of the certificate, the requester might request that the certificate be revoked, and the CA would do so. So here we're going to focus especially on the first part of the certificate life cycle, the request of a certificate to a CA. And if you've ever had to set up a certificate, especially in the old days before Let's Encrypt came along, you would have had the experience of creating a certificate signing request that you submitted to a certificate authority. And this is where the requester is proving the possession of the secret key that they want certified. Okay. There are actually several ways to do this in the X.509 PKI standards. So there's an interactive challenge response protocol, if you're doing a public key encryption type public key, there is a mechanism for doing this as well, where the certificate authority sends the certificate back to the requester encrypted under the certificate public key. Now, both of these are somewhat undesirable, I would say. The first one, it requires interactivity, that the client, that the requester and the certificate authority can interact in real time. And a lot of companies, this just isn't the case. The place where the certificate is requested, the server, the production server where it's going to be used, may not have a live communication channel to the certificate authority, either because of network configurations or because of business configurations. For example, because the employees with the account, the certificate authority, are different from the employees who are setting up the system. And sending something back encrypted under the subject public key imposes this weird confidential requirement on certificates. So I don't really like that. The mechanism that we'd like to use, and that is used for the vast majority of certificate issuances, is a non-interactive certificate signing request, where for signature public keys, you sign something using the secret key corresponding to the public key you want authenticated. And there's a standard format for this in an RFC listed here. And CSRs are great and they're widely used, but they're only good for signature schemes, not for public key encryption schemes or key encapsulation mechanisms. This hasn't been a problem in the past because almost all of our certificates, especially on the web, have been things that can be used for signatures, either ECDSA type keys or RSA keys that can be used for both signing and public key encryption. But for KEMs, we can't do this. And so we have to have something else if we want to have a non-interactive certificate signing request. So our goal was to design a non-interactive proof of possession for lattice-based KEM public keys so that we can achieve the same certificate lifecycle for KEM certificates to enable KEMTLS. And so because I'm short on time, I guess I won't be able to say too much about this. There are a few possible approaches that you might take. The obvious one is to use a zero knowledge proof of knowledge. And to build a zero knowledge proof of knowledge, you can either build something directly using lattices for the zero knowledge construction, or some generic approaches like SNARKs or multi-party computation in the head. The direct approaches are compelling because they can be fairly efficient and small, but also somewhat unsatisfactory in that they require embedding the target KEM parameters in a larger lattice instance. So if you want to prove possession of a Kyber public key, you have to do so by embedding it in a larger module LWE instance, which would actually require selecting new parameters for the proof itself. And selecting lattice parameters is hard. We've been spending 5 years doing that in the NIST competition, so we'd like to avoid that. Snarks are good, but not as efficient. And multi-party computation in the head requires larger proofs. So we have this approach that we're calling verifiable generation, where you generate the key and a proof at the same time. And we can do so using a multi-party computation in the head approach. And we're going to be able to do so in a way that avoids the inefficiencies of generic multi-party computation in the head approaches, but still achieves fairly small parameters and doesn't require picking new lattice parameters. I guess I'll just skip to the summary of this because I should get to questions. So this verifiable generation approach generally uses reasonable proof sizes and runtimes for both PhotoChem and Kyber. Our smallest sizes can be around 12 kilobyte proofs for Kyber, and this is competitive with even the best direct lattice-based zero-knowledge constructions, but we don't need to embed in a new lattice instance with different parameters. And it's orders of magnitude smaller than previous MPC and head approaches. So this is really quite practical, and we can do small tens of kilobytes proofs in sub-second or even tenth of a second times. Okay, so this overall is the story of KEMTLS so far, an implicitly authenticated TLS handshake replacement that uses KEMs rather than signatures for server authentication, with the goal of saving bytes on the wire and also saving server CPU cycles. I talked about the design of the protocol, a variant for client authentication, some of our efforts on proving it, as well as our attempts at creating support for certificate signing requests using KEM public keys. So there's a bunch of links here. The last two works aren't quite out yet, but they should be coming soon to an ePrint server near you. So I'll wrap up here. Thanks very much for your time. And I'll try to answer the questions in the chat as well as any other questions that you might have.
Thank you, Douglas. Yes, we will check the server that is closer to us for these papers.
Right, so yes. I guess there had been this question from Ricardo about how to integrate post-quantum algorithms and certificate chains. So hopefully I've answered most of that questions. I think, as I've said, we certainly do need to have, so for KEMTLS, we would have an end server certificate that has a KEM public key in it, but we would have post-quantum signatures on the rest of the chain for the certificate authority's signature and intermediate certificate authority signature. There is some, in principle, we can just use post-quantum algorithms and drop those in. We'd have to make sure that any size requirements are met on any intermediate protocols. There is some work going on hybrid certificates in the LAMPS working group to try to figure out how to convey hybrid public keys, so both classical and post-quantum public keys, and how we should interpret those, whether as requiring both algorithms to pass or just either algorithms to pass. So if you're interested in that, Mike Owensworth and others have some interesting discussion and drafts on that in the IETF's LAMPS working group, LAMPS.
Thank you, Douglas. I wanted to ask you, what has been the reaction towards KEMTLS proposal? Do you think what has been the reaction from the industry, from the academy?
Yeah, so we've gotten some positive response and some more cautious response. Some of the work that I've cited here, especially this internet draft already sketching out KEMTLS in IETF for the IETF, has some co-authors from Cloudflare, and they seem to be interested in KEMTLS for some of its bandwidth and performance characteristics, especially that it saves, it can improve performance on the servers because they run a lot of servers. When we did present this to the TLS working group, there was some caution about it because it does require changing the TLS state machine, and they're quite reluctant to do so because that's a fairly substantial change to the TLS protocol. So I think we really do need to have a compelling performance case. I showed you this one graph with the different trade-offs. If NIST finalizes N2 and Falcon, for example, the performance difference between N2 and Falcon, at least the size difference between N2 and Falcon, is very minimal. So there isn't as compelling a case for KEMTLS. Whereas if it ends up being Kyber and dilithium, then there is a more compelling case on the communication size front. So possibly, we'll see. But I think the answer isn't clear cut yet.
Thank you. More questions for Douglas that you may have? Questions? So what about rainbow in that case?
What about rainbow? Well, yeah. That's the big question, and I guess we'll hopefully see soon what NIST thinks about the future of rainbow. Rainbow is compelling in some cases because it has these really small signatures. So if you thought about our web PKI and you did all of the root certificate authorities in Rainbow, that would be quite attractive in some senses, because all of our root certificates authorities public keys have to be pre-installed in browsers and operating systems. So we don't have to transmit their public keys live over the channel. We'd have to distribute them in advance, but maybe that's less performance sensitive. And we'd be able to use 66 byte signatures on inside of our certificates. So that would be quite compelling. And I think that kind of trade-off is probably why NIST kept Rainbow around for as long as they have. But we've seen concerns about whether the Rainbow parameters are the right parameters. So I think it's not quite at the stage where we'd feel comfortable using Rainbow. And we'll see what NIST decides is the future of Rainbow, perhaps a revision in around 4 or something like that.
That's right. Thank you. Okay, so do we have more questions for Douglas before wrapping up? Yes. In the case of psych, the problem is the performance, right? Douglas is.
Yeah. So psych is really compelling from a communication size perspective, and we saw that psych did allow us to have really small handshakes and sometimes less than 2 kilobytes, but at the cost of increased runtime, both on the client and the server, and a visible increase in runtime, perhaps 20 milliseconds is non-trivial. But psych performance has been getting better and better. When we first did this a few years ago with a less optimized implementation, the performance gap for psych was not 5 or 10 milliseconds, but 30, 50 milliseconds. So hopefully we'll continue to see psych get faster and faster and become an even more compelling option.
That's right. Exactly. Okay, thank you very much, Douglas, for this very nice presentation. We have learned a lot. If you guys don't have more questions for Douglas, so let's thank the speaker, and thank you very much for your participation.